In this lesson, we'll paint this kind of cute Halloween little scene, but we're really going to be trying to study the idea of rim light, that bright crescent of light that you often see on objects, pumpkins or jack-o'-lanterns or anything else really. When the light is low, sort of spotlighting the object and it's low and from the back, and you get just these little crescents of brighter light, and we're really going to study that in this lesson as well as painting this fun little scene here. So this is our scene drawn on a piece of paper that's about 7 by 7. It's really a study more than a finished painting, although you might come out with a result that you really like and consider it a finished work. But what we're trying to do here is really study the idea of rim light, which is that soft sliver of light. It's often bright and it's often contrasted with some really dark darks around it. But the sliver of light that often happens when light is behind or off to the extreme left or right of a subject, and low on the horizon if it's the sun or the moon. And it creates just a little bit of a halo, a little bit of a lit crescent on the object. It leaves the rest of the object in shadow, and we're going to try to capture that effect in this study here. And again, we've included 3 pumpkins, one of which has got a jack-o'-lantern face on it, and we're going to work with that as well. But for the most part, what we're trying to get in here is that idea of rim light. Again, the thin sliver of light that's touching just the back edges, and in the case of this pumpkin, a bit of the side edge, lighting it up and creating that, again, very striking, dramatic light effect that's often seen in dramatic paintings and spookier paintings and scenes that are a little bit ominous looking themselves. You can download the drawing layout, and it'll show you what to put on the paper. You can freehand it if you like, or you can trace it onto your paper just to make it easier. Do make sure your pencil lines are fairly light. If they're not, you can blot them. That's what I do with my kneaded eraser. I simply touch it to the paper, blot it as if I'm picking up maybe something liquid with a sponge or something, same idea, but in this case it's picking up graphite on the surface of the kneaded eraser. We're going to have a lot of darks in this, so those pencil lines would probably not show up all that much, but I like to have a nice habit of cleaning up those pencil lines in my drawing. Okay, so that's the drawing that we'll be painting on. We're going to go take a look at the brushes and colors, and then we're going to jump in. So these are the brushes I'm going to use for my study of rim light. I've got out 6 colors here. We won't be using a lot of most of them, actually. I have a couple blues, cerulean blue, which we'll be using really for the effect of that rim light, that bluish kind of night light. We're going to pretend that these pumpkins are lit by moonlight, perhaps, and that blue will be the color we use for that light. We'll also use it on the ground plane, the part of the ground plane that does not have a cast shadow on it, and it'll be combined with some of these other colors to do that as well. The pumpkins, of course, need to be orange, but not bright orange really, because they're in shadow, or most of what we see is in shadow. But I'll be using cadmium orange. If you don't have cadmium orange, you can use whatever orange you happen to have on the palette. If you don't have an orange, you can always mix cadmium yellow, which is this puddle, with something like cadmium red, and you'll get an orange that'll work. I do have cadmium yellow out because one of the pumpkins is a jack-o'-lantern lit from the inside with a candle, and we want that warm glow from the candle to be showing through the openings in the front of the pumpkin where there are cutouts for the eyes and nose and mouth. We'll be mixing the ultramarine with the cadmium orange to get some of that shadow color for the pumpkins. We'll also use some mixtures of burnt sienna with ultramarine to get some of the darker areas on the sides of the pumpkins that we're looking at. So I have those colors out as well. And then just for variety, really in the background, we could use a mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna. But I've got out quinacridone burnt scarlet. Now, if you don't happen to have this color, when we get to the background, that's where I'm going to use that. You can simply use ultramarine blue and burnt sienna for that background. So that's the color set. It's, for me, flat brushes. These will keep me from getting fussy. They'll also allow me to cover a lot of the paper all at once. So they get the large shapes in, particularly the large dark shapes in, and nice and fluid. And it'll really work really well for these pumpkins, this subject. So those are the colors, the brushes. You can get those out and ready to go. And we're going to be jumping into the painting in just a minute. All right, so we're ready to get started. Now the first layers of paint that we're going to put on really are the colors that represent the lightest areas of the painting. The blue for the rim light that's on the essentially just slivers of the back sides and a little bit of the side of this pumpkin. We're going to get that in. That's cerulean blue. And we're going to get in that warm glow, mostly with cadmium yellow, but we'll mix in a little bit of the orange as well to get a light version of yellow or yellow-orange that's going to show through those cutout openings in the jack-o'-lantern in the front here. First, the rim light. The rim light, again, is the cerulean blue. That's the lighter of the two blues. And I'm just going to put that in. Again, we'd see a little bit of that on the side of this pumpkin. We'll see a little bit over here, but we get into shadow there, and there might be just a bit showing on the top of that pumpkin. Really quick, easy strokes. I did use a big 1-inch flat to do that, but big, easy, non-fussy strokes, that's the way to do it. While that's sort of drying, I'm going to get some of my cadmium yellow and a little bit of the orange in it as well. And just paint that through this part of the face, really, of this jack-o'-lantern. This is where that warm glow is going to be working its way through those cutout openings in the jack-o'-lantern. And we want that warm glow there so that we'll have it, rather than have to paint it in later, you know, being fussy and trying to paint into those little openings. Those are the first two layers. I am going to soften edges here a little bit with some clear water. But after that, what I'm going to do is dry the painting and then come back into it with the other colors, the darker colors that we need for the scene. So get these first little bits done, dry it, and then come back in. So the first layers are on and finished, and they're dry. And as you can see, especially that blue, the cerulean blue we put on in the back, a little bit of the top, the back, and the sides of these pumpkins, doesn't really look like light at this point. It will look like light once we get the darker colors in there, the contrasting colors and values that we need to show that this is lit, again, by some, perhaps moonlight in this case, but some sort of cool light in the background, and actually low again. So for the rest of the pumpkin, which is really the shadier parts, we're going to work with a mixture of cadmium orange and ultramarine blue to start. We get an orange that's a little bit neutral. We can get some of the bright orange in there as well. We're going to be mixing some other colors in here, kind of wet into wet. I'm making some marks where there might be some shadowy areas back in there, and then I'm continuing with that same mixture. I'm trying to get, first of all, this nice wet wash worked around the edge of that pumpkin that's in the middle. That's really kind of our star. And I'm trying to get these darker colors as well, these darker hues, these darker values that we need really to set off the light in other parts. And we want to keep that really looking like the shadow area. So I'm also going to mix up some ultramarine and burnt sienna. And the farther around I come on this face of the pumpkin, I'm going to add that in. Again, I've got this nice fluid wash. Allows me to mix and mingle, add things. A little bit darker value there. Maybe we've got a crevice there. And those darker values would really be dark right through here. This is where we're turned as far as possible away from the light. So this is really the shady side. I'm going to start to put in the cast shadow, believe it or not. I've got that dark value on my brush anyway. We need those dark values for that dark shadow, especially right under the pumpkins. It's really the darkest right under there. That's an area called the occlusion, or the occlusion shadow, the occlusion area, and it's generally darkest in that spot. I'm working around all three of these with that color. You can see that shifted a little bit towards blue. I'll go back and pick up some more of that darker mixture just to blend it. I'm going to cut this one short where that smaller pumpkin is casting its shadow, and then bringing out the rest of it. Again, really dark right under here. Other areas of the cast shadow would be perhaps a little bit lighter because they've got some whatever amount of ambient light or bounce light is out there. It probably has some of that in it, so it can be a little bit lighter out here, but you want it really, really dark under those objects. Notice how I've connected this pumpkin to the shadow. You can really not even make out the bottom of the pumpkin. I'm going to modify that a little bit by getting some of the brighter orange and mingling it right into those wet areas. Again, as if there's just the hint of bounced light, and it is lighting up just a little bit of the crevices between those different sections of the pumpkin. And again, that'll mix and mingle in there, and it'll look really nice and continue that idea of the fact that this is orange. These pumpkins are supposed to be orange. All right, so we'll go on to the next one. And again, there's some areas here, some crevices. We do want to keep that rim light in most of it, but where it starts to turn away, I've got that mixture of cadmium orange, or whatever orange you happen to be using, and ultramarine blue. It's a really nice complementary combination that works well for a lot of things, actually, but really well for this subject. As I work my way into the face where, again, there's a candle in there glowing, burning away, lighting up those openings that have been cut. I'm going to keep that orange a little brighter and warmer and a little bit lighter. That's more kind of pure cadmium orange right in here. And that'll get the sort of transparent glow. The lights inside the pumpkins generally light up the flesh a little bit. The light glows through to some degree. And I'll touch it over here into this ultramarine blue, and we'll get some of that cooler, shadier color for the shady side of the pumpkin. And the part of the pumpkin that's really away from the candle glow. This time a little bit of some darker color, darker value, actually on that stem. Down in maybe the crevices. I don't want to leave too much white paper there either. Down here at the bottom of the pumpkin where, again, it's very dark under there. Soften an edge here. I'm just going to get a little clear water and soften that transition a little bit. And I'm happy with that. I'm going to go on to the smaller pumpkin that sits back here, almost completely in shadow, and it's not a jack-o'-lantern. It's not, doesn't have any face carved into it. So I'm going to make it pretty dark and pretty neutral, actually, with a combination of the cadmium orange and the ultramarine blue initially. Right here along this edge, I'm going to be careful because I think both of those pumpkins are still wet, and I don't want too much of that darker color to blend into that middle pumpkin. All right, there's our second layer. I like what I have here. I think I have just enough. So it's time to dry this once more. We'll come in and get in that dark background, a little bit of detail, and we'll be done. All right, so here's the pumpkins, pretty much finished. There's a little bit more to do, but we can now do the background and the foreground. So the lit area here, the foreground, again, whatever light is coming from the back, lighting up that little sliver on the pumpkins is also lighting up this surface where they're sitting, and we're going to put that color in. We'll also get a dark color into the background, and that's where we're going to go first. That color is actually a mixture of ultramarine blue and, in my case, burnt scarlet, quinacridone burnt scarlet. It creates this nice neutral sort of violet color. Right here I'm going to be careful to paint around the edge of that pumpkin because I want to make sure that I have that really nice edge. And I want that dark background to really contrast with the lit area on the pumpkin, and that dark background is really what does it. Notice how that light really pops as soon as you get those dark colors in there. I'm actually putting them in even darker. I'm going to paint around the stem. The marks I'm making have lots of color in them, but they also have lots of water, so it lets them, the different brush strokes, mix and mingle together. Again, ultramarine and burnt scarlet. If you don't have that, use ultramarine and burnt sienna. Use plenty of color in those brush strokes as well as plenty of water to make sure that those individual brush strokes mix together. The edges of them blend together, the colors blend in that background. Painting around that stem. And once you have that in, you really should turn on that light, especially on that pumpkin back there where we're getting all that contrast. It really should look like that rim light, that bright light from the background is working its way into that pumpkin and really lighting up those lit areas. All right, now for the rest of this is mostly cerulean, but I've got some of that darker mixture that I have in the background, just a touch of it in the cerulean color, and that'll create this bluish light on all of the surfaces here that aren't in cast shadow. And then once we have that, a little bit of detail. Doesn't take a lot to do this. I am going to darken certain areas on this pumpkin just to get that light to show a little bit better back there. I'll make some marks that indicate those low spots, those grooves, if you will, between the sections of the pumpkin. This is real subtle work. I don't put a lot of color on. I don't fill those marks in completely. I do, however, blend those edges. I don't really want hard edges up there. I want soft transitions, soft, gradual transitions. That means gradations of color for the most part. And again, where I have a hard edge that really stands out, I just pick up some clear water and blend it. I didn't show this brush at the beginning, but I've got a little round that I'm going to use to get just a touch of color on some of these surfaces down inside the carved area, inside the teeth here, underneath the eyes, a little bit in the nose, because we would be seeing a little bit of the thickness of the pumpkin there, and that is important for that reason. Back here on this stem, I don't want it to be white paper. I also don't want it too dark, but I'm going to get some color on there. Shadier color. And I can see that my small pumpkin, I really don't have any of those edges that look like the grooves or the low parts between sections. So I'm going to get some of that in. A little bit darker mark here and here. A little bit there. Again, I don't fill them in completely. And I do sort of soften them up. Now, right here, right there, that edge really should be darker than it is. Where the smaller pumpkin sits in behind the middle pumpkin, the jack-o'-lantern, that really needs to be darker. I'm going to do that now. And this is just, again, that mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. I bring it out a ways. I get it dark there, but I bring it out and then I soften that edge. Clear water to soften the edge. A little bit more of that back here to show some of the darker areas, lower areas where there's not some of that rim light, and a little bit of color on the stem. And that's it. So there you have it. The whole idea here was to show that rim light, that crescent, if you will, of light, of bright light coming from a single light source, the moon perhaps, or some other light source, lighting from the back and low any object, but in this case these three pumpkins, and leaving that little bit of light, a little very small crescent of light around the edge of the pumpkin, the top and a little bit on the sides. And then trying to show everything else really in darker values, a darker background, a dark cast shadow in front of the pumpkins and the jack-o'-lantern. And that's how it turns out. So hopefully you came out with a nice effect. You can always go back and try it again if you're not really pleased with it. But the key is, again, the contrast between the dark and light areas. And in this case, the cool blue light with the warmer colors in the shadows and actually on the pumpkins themselves. So give it a try. I hope you had fun and enjoyed our kind of funny little scene here today, and also learned about that idea of what's known as rim light.